What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish at the Moment. In this video, I want to share my top 5 offshore bass fishing lures for July. Let's get into it. First, let's start off with my most productive offshore bass fishing lure in July of all time, a hair jig. This is a 1/2 ounce Cumberland Pro white hair jig, and it excels at catching suspended bass offshore when water temperatures are very warm, above 80 degrees. A lot of times in the summer, bass will set up in schools and set up on the bottom, on the lips of ledges, offshore rock piles, or around brush piles, especially in May and June. However, as water temperatures get warmer, a lot of these schools will start to break up a little bit, and the bass will suspend around these drops and spread out across these areas, making them harder to target with traditional offshore baits. That's where the hair jig comes in. This bait excels at covering water on an offshore ledge, but it also targets fish that are suspended and roaming. The way I fish it is basically casting it out, letting it sink all the way down to the bottom, then reeling my reel handle 4 to 5 times very quickly, and then letting that bait fall with my reel engaged. I basically want to let that bait fall on a semi-slack line, glide down to the bottom, and then when it hits the bottom again, I'm going to reel it 5 or 6 times again, and then let it fall back down to the bottom. This will imitate a shad, a dying shad, out on these offshore areas. And I really like to target any type of offshore area I can find with this hair jig in July, whether that is a rounded point with a rock pile on it, an offshore ledge, a long ridge, or a shoal. It really doesn't matter. As long as there are bait fish in the area and some suspended bass, the hair jig is awesome. I find that I can catch a lot of better quality fish in July too if I find smaller wolf packs of bass offshore, maybe 6 to 8 bass grouped together, rather than these giant schools of like 30 to 40 fish, which are also harder to find in July. This hair jig is a bait I still feel like a lot of guys don't utilize enough, especially on places outside of like the Tennessee River. So if you guys haven't thrown a hair jig before, definitely check it out. I'll also leave a video down in the description of this video to explain how I fish the hair jig, and complete breakdown of my gear, all that stuff. Definitely check out that video if you want more info. Next, I want to talk about a brand new bait that just came to market from a local bait maker in my area, Bent Bill Customs. This is the Little Bender Mini Glide Bait, and as the name implies, it is a small little glide bait that has the same action as a lot of the bigger chopping style glide baits that you see on the market, but comes in a much smaller profile. I was a little bit skeptical of this bait when I first saw it, but a few of my friends actually took me out with this bait, and we absolutely destroyed them in March, 46-degree water temperatures on Beaver Lake, and the fish would come off the bottom 20 feet to come destroy this bait. I've now been throwing it off camera for about, I guess ever since March, and I haven't been able to really talk about it because it hasn't been on the market, and I didn't want to talk about it too soon, but I finally got permission from the creator to talk about it in a video, and this bait is absolutely amazing. The way I've been working it in the last couple of weeks is actually fishing it like a wake bait over the top of suspended fish that are roaming on points and ledges and things like that. They'll basically come up out of deeper water to come hit this bait near the surface, and I just fish it on a very steady, nice retrieve. Basically cast it out, let it hit the surface of the water, and then just slowly wind that bait in. This bait will draw fish from a very large distance, and then when they get up close, you can speed the reel up a little bit, give it a couple twitches, a couple chops, and it makes them go crazy. This bait's really interesting too because it has similar drawing power to a bigger glide bait, especially in clearer water, but you get a lot more bites. If I threw a glide bait all day on Beaver Lake, I might expect to get 50 fish to follow it and maybe 5 to 8 to commit. Or with this bait, I might get 40 followers a day, but 20 of them actually commit to the bait. Now, not all of them are going to be super big. You're going to catch a lot of 12 to 14 inches on this bait, but I've caught some really big ones as well, and a lot of doubles, surprisingly, on this bait. So it's a really cool deal. In July, I think as these fish start to suspend more and chase bait out in open water, which they're prone to do, especially on clear water lakes, this bait is going to draw them in very well, and if you work it near the surface, you can get a lot of great bites. I also would love to hear some people's experiments fishing this up shallow or on brim beds and things like that. This bait is actually only available right now online, and I'll leave a link down in the description where you can pick this bait up. It's available just in the bone color right now. There aren't any painted versions for sale, but I am very interested to see some painted versions of this bait too, especially maybe in like a bluegill pattern for those brim bed fish or some really cool shad patterns. So if you guys do pick one of these up and get them painted, send me an email. I would love to see what it looks like. And if any of you want to paint one of these baits for me, let me know down in the comments, because I would love to get a paint job on one of these. I've just been throwing it in the bone color and it's been working fantastic. And the only modification I really make to it is I add a little split ring or a snap to the front of this bait, which just weights it down a tiny bit, gets it a little bit deeper. And I'm just pairing it on a standard jerkbait rod. That's something I love about this bait. It casts great on a 7-foot medium moderate action Denali Lithium Pro jerkbait rod. Super easy to throw. I'll throw it on like 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon line and a 6-to-1 gear ratio reel, and they absolutely choke this thing. So really cool bait. Definitely check it out using the link down in the description. Next up is probably my second most effective July bait of all time, the big worm. This is the Zoom 10.5-inch Old Monster in the plum apple color. It's the only color I throw, clear or dirty water. And whenever bass are setting up around cover, whether that's brush piles, rock piles, standing timber, shell beds, even offshore grass, in July, I'm throwing that big worm. It is a great combo with that hair jig. When those fish are suspended, I throw the hair jig around bait, and then when they're closer to the bottom, I'll throw the big worm. Traditionally, I was always pairing this big worm with a tungsten slip sinker that I pegged, and I would use a 3/8 ounce size with a 5/0 offset worm hook. However, I've recently been throwing the new Core Tackle Ozark rig, and we designed this 5/0 3/8 ounce size, the Ozark rig, to pair perfectly with this big worm. A lot of people have asked me what the difference between throwing a Texas rig and throwing the Ozark rig is with this worm. Well, there's a couple of advantages. One, on the fall, this big worm will actually have a shimmy motion, and I'll show you some underwater footage here comparing it to a standard Texas rig. Basically, that bait will wobble off center and give some extra motion as that bait falls, which is very unique and something that a standard Texas rig cannot replicate. In addition, I've found that this rig comes through brush way better than the standard Texas rig. I've been throwing this in a bunch of brush piles this summer, and the only time I ever lose one of these rigs is when I think I have a bite, I set the hook, and actually set into the brush pile. Otherwise, it comes out clean every single time. It's absolutely crazy how well this comes through, and I think it's just because that weight will keel down and cause the hook point to always stay up. And as a result, it comes through brush really well, and when a fish eats it, you usually hook them in the top of the mouth because, again, that hook point is always up. This rig is incredible, guys. I just made a video a couple of days ago where I caught some really big fish on it, so check out that video if you want to see how I find offshore areas to throw this big worm in. But if you haven't tried that 5/0 3/8 ounce Ozark rig, or just any of the Ozark rigs in general on a worm, definitely give it a try. That unique shimmy action on the fall is something that these bass have not seen, and very few guys are throwing this setup, so you'll have an advantage over other anglers on your lake with this bait. I always pair this bait with a Denali Lithium Pro 7'4" heavy power, fast action bait casting rod with 20-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon and an Abu Garcia Black Max reel. That 20-pound fluorocarbon is really great when you throw a big worm because you're throwing around really thick cover, and I found that it doesn't really matter that much if you are throwing 15-pound versus 20 pounds. So just go with the 20-pound line and you're good to go. So that's my number 3 bait. The next bait I want to talk about is kind of a cross between the hair jig and the big worm, at least in terms of how I fish it. This is a Neko Rig. It's a 7-inch Magnum hit worm by Berkley, and I'm pairing that with a 1/32 up to a 3/32 ounce nail weight in the tail. I'll pair that with this Owner Sniper weedless Neko hook, which is perfect for fishing around cover. And what I've found is that when fish are suspended in and around cover, specifically standing timber, brush piles, and rock piles, I can fish this Neko rig and get a lot of bites where I can't throw the hair jig because it would get hung up, and where the Texas rig worm really doesn't excel because it goes straight to the bottom in most cases. The way I fish this Neko rig is basically casting it out, letting it hit the bottom, then I shake my rod tip up, high into the air, bringing that bait 5 to 10 feet off the bottom. I then let that bait slowly sink down, and then I lift it back up after it hits the bottom, similar to how I fish that hair jig, but just a slower retrieve. And what I find is that the bass will follow that bait either up off the bottom, or if they're suspended, it'll catch their attention at the apex of that retrieve, and then as it falls back down, they either eat it as it's falling, or they chase it all the way down to the bottom and pick it up off the bottom. This is a deadly bait that I always have tied on, and I throw in the same situations I would throw both the hair jig and the big worm. If they're not biting the hair jig that well, or I feel like I've got them conditioned to it, I pick up the Neko Rig. And then if I catch a few fish on the big worm and I feel like the spot is kind of slowing down, again, pick up the Neko Rig. It's kind of my follow-up bait to both the hair jig and the big worm, and it's absolutely awesome. In terms of my gear, I am throwing it on a 7'4" medium heavy power fast action Denali Lithium Pro spinning rod with 15-pound or 20-pound braided line for my main line, depending on how thick of the cover I'm fishing that day, and then 8-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon leader. Just pairing that with Denali reel here, and really the setup is pretty critical because you're throwing this bait pretty far out and getting around cover. So you want a little bit heavier rod and a longer rod so that when you set the hook, you can pull them away from cover, pull them out of deep water, and get a really good hook set. If you're using a lighter rod or too short of a rod, you're going to lose fish with this rig. So definitely invest in one of these longer spinning rods. If you're gonna be fishing offshore with a Neko Rig, it will put more fish in the boat for you. Last but not least is my favorite bait for catching really big fish in July. That's an oversized crankbait. There's a lot of oversized deep diving crankbaits on the market that work great, including a 10XD, there's the Megabass Big M 7.5, but my new favorite right now is this Blitz Magnum EXDR from OSP. It's a 30-foot diving crankbait, and it's a little bit pricey, but I have caught more big fish actually this summer on this bait than any other bait for whatever reason. You can grind the bottom with this bait in 25 to 30 feet of water on 15-pound fluorocarbon line, which is incredible. It's a really deep diving bait. It gets down really deep quickly, so you can keep it in the strike zone a long time. And also when you burn it and then pause it, the bait will stay down there deep. It doesn't rise super fast. So you can kind of work it almost like a jerk bait in those deeper water areas. And it actually comes through brush really well because the bill is so big. And I've had this one crankbait and fished it through probably 35, 40 brush piles one day and still did not lose it. So that is a really good deal. I'll throw it in these more natural, more translucent colors when I'm fishing in very clear water, let's say 3 to 10 foot of visibility. And then when I'm fishing in dirtier water than that, I'll go to a more matte white finish on the crankbait. The areas I'm targeting with this bait are anywhere the bass are setting up near offshore cover or offshore structure in 25 plus feet of water. A lot of bass in July will set up pretty deep on a lot of these lakes. So I will use this bait to basically target those really deep fish that oftentimes don't see a crankbait. And because they're not used to seeing a crankbait that deep, I feel like it really gets those fish excited, and I get a lot more big bites on this bait than pretty much anything else, because I think that these fish are just not accustomed to it. You really want to grind that bait down in the rocks though, and work it pretty quick because it is a reaction strike you're generating with this bait. So you don't want to slowly wind it in. You want to be grinding that bait through those areas, and you're going to put some big fish in the boat. As far as my gear, I'm throwing a 7'10" extra heavy power, moderate action Denali Lithium Pro Magnum crankbait rod. That moderate action rod is really important with these big crankbaits and those treble hooks, but that long rod that has a little bit more power in the backbone allows you to cast that bait a long ways and also set the hook with these bigger hooks when they're far away from the boat. I'm pairing that up with 14 to 15 pound fluorocarbon depending on what brand you're using, and then a Abu Garcia Black Max winch reel. It's a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel. I don't think they make this anymore. This is like a 5 or 6 year old reel, but basically a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel will help you reel that bait in a little bit easier. It has less fatigue on you when you're fishing it for a long period of time. And even though you're burning that bait in, you may think you want to use a 6-to-1 or 7-to-1 gear ratio reel, but that 5-to-1 gear ratio will allow you to fish this bait for longer. You won't wear out your forearms all day, and it'll just allow you to have a lot more enjoyable day on the water. So those are my top 5 July baits, guys. They're very skewed towards offshore bass fishing. There's a lot of other great July baits for shallow water fishing. You know, I'd have a frog or a buzz bait or other things like that if I was fishing up shallow. But you guys know me, I love offshore bass fishing. So hopefully this video is helpful for you and gives you a few options for fishing offshore in July. If you enjoyed and want to pick up any of these baits, I have links to all of my equipment down in the description. And definitely check out that new Bent Bill Customs Mini Glide. There's not very many of them available. They're gonna go out of stock very quick. So if you do want one of these, definitely go pick them up because they're gonna go fast. Anyways, guys, thanks for checking out this video. We'll see you all next one.